Their silence wasn't fear. It was them waiting for the right person to arrive. The Georgia night was so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. On that empty rural road, power was switched on with a single flash of red and blue lights. The deputy stepped in, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who believed a badge gave him the right to judge another human being in seconds. Two black men stepped out of the car slowly by the book. No questions, no reactions, no explanations offered. That calm did not de-escalate the moment. It irritated the one holding authority. Because usually people beg, people panic. Here there was only silence. A kind of silence not meant to plead but to endure. In that moment, a decision was made, not based on evidence, not based on truth, but on the instinct that power needed to be asserted. These two men didn't look like criminals, yet they were treated as if they had to be. And they did not resist, not because they were weak, but because they were disciplined. Those who have lived through war understand this deeply. Some battles are not won with fists. They are won by standing still and letting the truth find its own way forward. If you believe that true courage is not found in gunfire but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our quiet heroes. Both windows rolled down at the same time slowly. They didn't need to look at each other to know exactly what to do. The interior light came on a soft glow, filling the cabin, exposing everything with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Two hands rose to the correct position, high enough to be seen no higher, no lower. No unnecessary movement. No gesture that could be misunderstood. Everything unfolded as if it had been practiced 1,000 times because it had. This was not the reflex of fear. It was the habit of people who had lived long enough inside discipline to understand that one small mistake could carry a consequence that could never be undone. There were no long explanations. No challenging questions, no sharp breaths, no confusion, only precise actions flowing one into the next like a sequence ingrained deep into the body. In that moment, silence became a deliberate choice, a silence built from experience, not submission. Follow the procedure. Give him no excuse. The thought passed cleanly and sharply stripped of emotion because those who have survived war know that emotion is a luxury in decisive moments. No one held the other man's gaze for too long. Not out of avoidance, but out of understanding the language of power. Some looks are read as challenges, and they were not there to challenge anyone. They were there to continue on their path. Every movement was measured, every breath kept steady. That calm, instead of easing the tension, made the air grow heavier, because someone accustomed to making others afraid always waits for a reaction, an apology, a plea, a justification, some sign that control is firmly in their hands. But here there was none of that. Documents. The voice came dry and blunt. Yes, one word. Short. Enough. The papers were handed over at exactly the right pace, not fast enough to seem nervous, not slow enough to be read as defiance. The moment stretched longer than usual, as if someone were searching for a crack in this cold precision, but there was none. Everything was too orderly, too clean, too correct, and that was precisely what allowed irritation to take root. Because in the world of those who impose themselves on others, order only exists when someone else is trembling. The silence continued. Not an empty void, but a heavy, invisible mass pressing down on the air. It spoke more loudly than any explanation ever could. It carried the message of people who had stood before real danger and knew how to tell the difference between a true threat and a man trying to prove his authority. Without saying it aloud, they both understood this situation did not require winning. It required not being wrong. It required giving no reason. On the other side, that calm was not read as discipline. It was interpreted as stubbornness, as a lack of fear, and to someone accustomed to obedience that was unacceptable. The quiet began to provoke. It did not shout, it did not taunt, but it functioned like a cold mirror reflecting insecurity back at its source. When there was no begging to cling to power, revealed itself as far more fragile than it liked to believe. Another beat of silence passed, longer, sharper. Within it, an invisible boundary was being tested. All three felt it, though no one spoke. Those who have survived war know this sensation well, the moment when everything is still within control, but one wrong decision could send it all slipping away. They remained still, in position, saying nothing unnecessary. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew there are moments when silence is the only answer that cannot be twisted. And that very silence, instead of closing the situation, became the reason a new escalation was about to begin. A sentence was thrown out light as smoke heavy as a predetermined verdict. I smell marijuana. No evidence required. No confirmation needed. Just the words themselves spoken to unlock whatever came next. The air changed instantly from quiet to severe. That excuse had been used so many times that no one truly believed it anymore. Yet it remained powerful enough to legitimize an authority eager to take another step forward. The car door was opened. Compartments were flipped. Items that had been neatly arranged were scattered not to search, but to prove the searcher's right to search. Every movement was fast and decisive, as if the outcome had already been chosen. Ethan and Marcus stood still. No questions, no objections, no glance at each other. Their silence was not consent. It was the last choice available to keep things from getting worse. They understood the procedure. They understood how a situation could derail over a single word spoken at the wrong time. "There's nothing here. Don't worry, I'll find something." The reply came clipped cold and loaded with intent. When people don't find what they're looking for, they often create it. A hand reached deeper than necessary. A moment out of sight. A small object appeared as if it had always been there. Truth was twisted in a split second enough to turn the innocent into the accused. No one cried out. No one flinched. This kind of deception was all too familiar to anyone who had seen power abused. "See, you think I'm stupid." The voice grew more certain now because it finally had something to lean on. A small bag, a large accusation, a road-opened one that's hard to turn back from. Injustice didn't arrive with an explosion. It arrived with procedure. It wore the clothes of legitimacy, walked casually, and called itself justice. The handcuffs snapped shut roughly unnecessarily as a reminder that control had been established. Cold metal pressed into wrists, tightening. Ethan didn't pull away. Marcus didn't turn. No one resisted. Not because they couldn't, but because they weren't allowed to. Discipline kept them still, even as every muscle knew they were stronger than this many times over. They had faced real danger before, and they knew that violence here would only give the other side an excuse to escalate further. Resisting an officer is a serious crime. "We're not resisting." I said, "Stand still." Short sentences. Cold. Sealing off every avenue of rebuttal. The insult came last unhidden. "I make the law on this road." Not a threat, a declaration. It said that here truth mattered less than whatever story the one in power chose to tell. It said that other people's dignity was just an obstacle to be pushed aside. Ethan lowered his head just enough to avoid direct eye contact. Marcus took a deep breath, kept it steady. Two men stood there bound by a false charge but not stripped of the most important thing: dignity. They did not plead, they did not beg, they did not shout to prove they were right. Because those who have lived through war understand that some battles are not won on the spot. Some truths need time to step into the light on their own. Get in the car. Yes, that was all. Not another word. The silence continued, not because they had no voice, but because they chose to place their trust in something larger than this moment. Every step was a decision to stay within the lines. Every second that passed was a test of discipline. Injustice had escalated, no longer hiding behind suspicion, but standing squarely in the open, confident in the uniform it was wearing. Neither of them turned back. They didn't need to look to know that power was intoxicated by itself. And in that intoxication, mistakes are often recorded with painful clarity, even when the one making them believes no one is watching. It is precisely when power believes itself safest that other eyes begin to look, and this story prepares to descend into a deeper layer where truth no longer needs noise to speak. The police station opened into a different world, one where the familiar smell of chemicals clung to the air like an invisible coat, cold and indifferent. Walls accustomed to confessions and the sound of metal meeting metal. Light that was steady and impartial, exposing everything the same way. In this place, people usually shrank. Voices lowered. Shoulders slumped out of habit. But the two men who entered did not change. They stood upright, feet set just far enough apart. Shoulders relaxed, heads held at an angle that neither challenged nor submitted. A posture not learned from law books, but from years of having to stand firm in places far harsher than this. The desk officer looked up, his gaze lingering longer than necessary, not out of curiosity, but because something didn't fit. Detainees usually leaned against the counter, against the wall, or against their own fear. These two did not. They held their own center as if the floor itself were part of their bodies. No one ordered them to stand that way. They stood that way because it was the only way they knew. A wallet opened for a brief moment. A card appeared, just a flash enough for the metallic edge to catch the observer's eye. DOD. 3 letters that made no noise yet carried an entire system behind them. The desk officer hesitated, said nothing, but his look changed. Before any question could be spoken, another hand swept in. A voice cut across, firm, decisive, leaving no room for doubt. Impersonating the military. The words were placed on the counter like a stamp. No debate, no verification, no check. Just a label so everything could keep sliding along the chosen momentum. The card disappeared. Suspicion was pushed aside. Procedure returned to its familiar track. Here, inconvenient details were removed quickly. The right to make a phone call was taken away with a short decision. No explanation needed. No lengthy paperwork. Just the phrase, "Not yet." The 2 men were led away through doors accustomed to the same footsteps passing through day after day. Everything around them suggested waiting for signatures, waiting for paperwork, waiting for time. But to them, waiting was a familiar state, not a punishment. The holding cell was small. Cold surfaces, old smells. They sat down back straight, not leaning, not collapsing. No one spoke for the first few seconds. This silence was different from the earlier ones. It wasn't meant to avoid mistakes, it was meant to restore internal order. Each man checked his breathing, knowing without looking that the other was doing the same. An old survival habit returned naturally. Let him write the report. The voice was low, without irritation. Just an observation. Then the system will notice on its own. The reply came a beat later, but steady. Not blind faith, but an understanding of how things work once they are written down. They didn't discuss resisting. They didn't mention lawyers. They didn't talk about what could be done to get out faster. Those options existed, but it wasn't time. They understood that every line written, every box checked on a form, left a trace. And traces do not disappear. They simply wait to be seen. Outside, routine work continued. Printers hummed, phones rang, pens touched paper. No one noticed that an invisible clock had begun counting down. Not the clock of the holding cell, but the clock of a larger system where irregularities are detected when they remain too still for too long in places they shouldn't be. The 2 men sat there calmly, not because they took this lightly, but because they understood its scale. Injustice can travel very far when it isn't stopped immediately. But for that very reason, it also reveals more than it intends to hide. There was no need to rush, no need to speak. Just let everything unfold exactly as it was choosing to. And while the room maintained its quiet somewhere else, numbers began not to add up. Markers lingered too long, and the first quiet attention turned toward the 2 names that had just been crossed off a list. Hundreds of miles away from that rural road, a morning began like any other at the naval base. The roll call was opened on time. Familiar names appeared in order. Those who were always punctual were as usual on time. And then 2 empty slots appeared right where there were never empty slots. No delay notice, no late report, no explanation, just absent. Where's Perkins? Where's Reed? The questions weren't asked loudly, but they were enough to slow the room by a single beat. These were not names easily overlooked. They weren't the kind of men who forgot to report, not the kind who let a schedule slip through their hands. When people like that vanished from a control board, the system did not call it coincidence. Check their travel itinerary. Already checked. They departed the base on time last night. Another screen was opened. The data displayed itself clearly, without emotion, without judgment. The vehicle's position was marked by a single stationary dot. No movement. No change. Not on the planned route. Not in any parking area belonging to the base. The vehicle is stationary. Where at the county sheriff's department? A brief pause followed. No one said that's impossible, because everyone understood that some things shouldn't happen and still do. And when they happen to men like these, the question is no longer what happened, but how far has it gone? Commander Lewis picked up the phone. His voice stayed neutral. No tension, no urgency. It was the voice of someone accustomed to solving problems before they escalated. This is Commander Lewis. I'm looking for 2 of my personnel. The voice on the other end responded slowly, then quickly grew impatient. We have no obligation to answer. I only need to confirm their status. There's no information for you. The call ended with a dry click. Lewis looked at the screen once more. The data was still there. The stationary dot was still stationary. The rudeness didn't surprise him. It confirmed only one thing: someone was deliberately keeping a door closed longer than usual. They won't verify number. Lewis nodded just slightly. No anger, no overreaction. Just a decision forming quietly in his mind. He understood exactly how this system worked. When one link refused to cooperate, it wasn't a sign of control, it was a sign of risk. Log the time. Logged. Another call was prepared, not to ask further questions, not to argue, only to signal that this situation had crossed the boundary of routine handling. Lewis looked at the name displayed on the screen. He didn't hesitate. Some names don't require long explanations. You only need to tell the truth. Admiral, we've lost contact with 2 men. The line went quiet for a few seconds, not from surprise, but from listening. Where were they last confirmed? At a county sheriff's department. A slow breath came through the line. No haste, no panic. Did they report a delay? No, sir. No further detail was needed. No full retelling required. Only what didn't align. And what didn't align was more than enough for the man on the other end. When disciplined men disappear from the system without leaving chaos behind, it isn't an accident. It's outside interference. I'll handle it. 3 words. Short, heavy. No one asked when. No one asked how. Because when that name was spoken, everyone understood that the largest gear in the system had begun to turn. No noise, no announcement, just a precise chain of reactions being set in motion. Lewis set the phone down. He didn't look back at the screen. There was no need. When silence is reported to the right level, it is no longer silence. It becomes a signal. And that signal had been received. On the other end, a decision was made, not from emotion, but from responsibility. And from that moment on, the path leading to the courtroom had already been drawn. The morning in the courtroom began with the familiar rhythm of procedure. Names were read, files were opened. The atmosphere was formal, yet indifferent, as if every human fate could be compressed into a few lines of text. The prosecutor stood voice steady and assured, reading the charges as if reciting a list already memorized. Each accusation was placed neatly in sequence, every word chosen to sound final, unquestionable. The defendants were called forward. 2 men stood before the bench backs, straight eyes steady, not searching for sympathy. The defendants are charged with unlawful possession. The defendants resisted a law enforcement officer. The statements landed without emphasis, without hesitation. They carried the weight of a story already written. In that moment, Ethan stepped forward half a pace, not crossing a line, only enough for his voice to be clearly heard. He did not raise it. He did not offer a long defense, just one sentence, short and direct. We were unlawfully detained. The room paused for a brief, almost imperceptible beat. Not because the words were shocking, but because they were so calm. The judge looked up, gavel already in hand. The prosecutor tilted his head as if preparing to respond. Those present were accustomed to defendants who spoke too much, spoke wrongly, spoke in desperation. This was different. It did not beg. It did not challenge. It was as plain as a status report. Defendant, maintain order. The gavel did not fall, not from hesitation, but because another movement had already occurred. The door at the back of the courtroom opened, not loudly, but enough to draw every head around. A group entered unhurried, not searching for empty seats. They moved straight ahead, as if they knew exactly where they belonged. Their presence needed no lengthy introduction. The mood of the room shifted before any name was spoken. Your Honor. The voice was low, clear, neither requesting permission nor issuing a threat. A voice accustomed to being heard. The prosecutor turned faintly surprised. The judge set the gavel down without striking it. There are moments when one kind of authority instinctively recognizes another greater and chooses silence. We represent the United States Navy. The final words fell like a newly drawn line. The air in the courtroom changed instantly. Not with fear, but with understanding. These people were not here to argue over small details. They were here because the entire story had veered beyond the limits of what could be accepted. Admiral Hawkins stepped forward a single pace, just enough for his gaze to encompass the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not emphasize a thing. His presence alone was a statement. He looked directly at the judge, then slowly shifted his eyes to the prosecutor before settling on the 2 men standing at the bench. You are detaining my assets. There was no anger in the words, no threat, only confirmation. The 2 men were not called defendants. They were not called by name. They were identified by their role within another system, one larger than this courtroom. A system where discipline is recognized, where silence is understood, and where deviations are not ignored simply because they wear the clothing of procedure. We are requesting the legal basis for this detention, immediately. The statements that followed were concise, precise, leaving no space for ambiguity. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then stopped. The judge looked down at the file, then back up. For the first time that morning, the balance no longer rested where it usually did. It had shifted quietly, decisively. Ethan and Marcus remained still. They did not look back. They did not turn to confirm what they had already known. They didn't need to. The silence they had carried from the beginning had completed its purpose. It had traveled far enough to be seen, and when truth is addressed at the proper level, it no longer needs to speak for itself. But that entrance was not the end. It was the beginning of the moment when false authority starts to collapse under the weight of questions it can no longer avoid. "Where is your body cam?" It malfunctioned. The answer came faster than thought, but not fast enough to cover the emptiness behind it. A file was opened. A timeline appeared. The most critical minutes were missing. No video, no audio, no reasonable explanation. The room fell silent for one beat, then another, as the next question was placed on the table. It failed at the exact moment of the vehicle search. Yes. No one laughed. No one acknowledged it. Only eyes moving from the file to the man standing in the center. Other records were presented. A bag of evidence, matching serial numbers, an earlier date, a different case, a different file, a different signature. This coincidence was no longer a coincidence. "How do you explain this? I don't remember." The voice began to falter, not from fear, but from losing its footing. When a story can no longer stand, the storyteller forgets details first. The questions came faster now, shorter, sharper. There was no room left for circling. Why was the body cam turned off? Why does the evidence match a previous file? Why doesn't the report align with the timeline? There were no complete answers, only fragments. And when enough fragments are laid out, the picture reveals itself without anyone needing to draw it. The silence at this moment was no longer disciplined restraint. It was the sign of a system finally staring straight at its own deviation. "Do you understand the consequences of fabricating evidence? I was just following procedure." That phrase had once been used to shield authority. This time it became evidence. With no defense left, irritation surfaced. A step backward, a shoulder rising, a hand drifting instinctively toward the hip where old habits lived. "Calm down." The warning came in time, but not enough to stop the reflex. The moment was brief, very brief, but long enough for everyone to understand that false authority always fears losing control. And when it fears, it reaches for violence as a last instinct. "Stop." Two words rang out clear and firm, not the command of a small room, but the standard of a larger system. The figures on either side stepped forward, not fast, not slow, no shouting, no spectacle, just action at the right moment. "You are being restrained." Everything happened cleanly, no prolonged struggle, no retaliatory threats, only truth being placed exactly where it belonged. The room released a breath, not relief, but confirmation the line had been held. Admiral Hawkins spoke last. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to ask for silence. It arrived on its own. He looked straight ahead, no anger, no contempt, only the gaze of someone who has seen enough to no longer need to prove strength. Authority does not reside in a badge. It resides in discipline when no one is watching. The statement was not aimed at one man. It was for the room, for the files, for the system examining itself. He said no more. There was no need to explain. Those who understood, understood. Those who didn't would learn another way. These men, he continued, voice steady, kept discipline when no one told them they had to. There was no need to name them, no need to list accomplishments. The two men standing ahead neither bowed their heads nor lifted them higher. They stood exactly as they had from the beginning. Correct posture, steady breathing, true to who they were. "And you," he said, turning, traded the credibility of an entire badge just to prove personal power. There was no reply. There was nothing left to say. False authority does not collapse with an explosion, but with the absence of trust. When trust leaves, everything that remains is empty procedure. The room recorded it. Reports were updated. Decisions were made. No noise, no applause. This lesson did not need an audience. It needed to be remembered. Ethan and Marcus said nothing. They didn't need to. The lesson was not about how they were cleared, but about how they never lost themselves throughout the process. Their quiet courage harmed no one, yet it was strong enough to force the truth into the open. And when false authority had collapsed under the weight of questions it could not answer, the story was ready to move forward to the place where what was silent would finally be remembered properly. Caldwell was placed in handcuffs before the morning had fully moved past the courthouse steps. There was no cheering crowd, no sympathetic glances, only the cold precision of federal procedure so exact it required no emotion at all. The man who once believed he made the law on that road now stood inside a system far larger than himself, one that had no interest in who he used to be. The badge was removed. Authority vanished as quickly as it had once been wielded without restraint. In the days that followed, old files were reopened, not one but dozens. Reports bearing the same language, familiar justifications repeated again and again. Body cam footage disappearing at the exact moments it mattered. Each detail once ignored was now placed side by side, forming a straight, unmistakable line. Truth did not need to shout. It only needed time to arrange itself. Wrongful convictions began to be overturned. People who had once left courtrooms with criminal records on their backs returned carrying the exhausted silence of years taken from them. Some had lost jobs, some had lost families, some had lost faith in both. Not everything could be restored, but at the very least their names were returned to where they belonged. At the very least, the truth was no longer buried beneath the signature of a man who believed himself above the law. Through all of this movement, Ethan and Marcus did not appear again. They did not stand before microphones. They did not answer questions. They did not accept public thanks. They left the courthouse the same way they had entered, quietly, correctly, without leaving a personal mark. Not because they didn't care, but because they understood one thing clearly: the story was never about them. "The outcome speaks for us," Marcus said softly when asked if he wanted to comment. One sentence. Enough. Ethan looked back at the building one last time, not to savor a victory, but to make sure he carried no anger with him as he left. He had learned this long ago in places where anger could kill more effectively than a bullet. Keeping yourself intact was the hardest thing of all. "Let's go," Ethan said. They walked away without looking back. The story did not end at the courthouse doors. It continued in small records rooms, in families receiving long overdue phone calls of apology, in children seeing their parents' names removed from criminal lists for the first time. These changes were not loud, but they were lasting, and they spread slowly like real discipline spreading through a good unit. No shots were fired in this story, no punches thrown, no violence elevated to heroism, just two men who chose to stand still, follow procedure, preserve dignity, and force a system to confront itself. That choice was not easy. It required a patience known only to those who have survived chaos. Their silence saved more people than any gunfire ever could. That sentence is not carved into stone. It does not hang in a hall. It lives in tangible outcomes and corrected verdicts in lives returned to their proper course. That is the true legacy. No medals required, no ceremonies needed. And if you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Brave Veteran Stories. We remember the quiet heroes.